So today I'm going to discuss various aspects of law per se, where money recovery is a major concern, and how you can help your clients give different options to recover the money that are either that they have lost or are facing problems in recovering. The first and the foremost law that I would like to deal with, and is my favorite amongst all, is Section 138 of Negotiable Instruments Act. Section 138 of Negotiable Instrument Act deals with dishonor of check for insufficiency, etc. of funds in the account. Now it says that where a person who holds a bank, who holds an account with an XYZ bank, draws a check in favor of somebody else in order to discharge any kind of a debt, either in whole or in part, and the check has been returned with an acknowledgement saying that there is not sufficient funds in that particular bank account held by the drawer, or that the amount arranged exceeds the amount arranged to be paid from that account. So there is an overdraft facility which every account holder has, and in that there is a specified limit until which the account holder can extend, even though, say for example, the account holder has 1 lakh rupees in his bank account. Because of the overdraft facilities, he can instruct the bank to make payments to the extent of, say, X amount, say 5 lakh rupees. So if he makes a check and draws a check in favor of a person which exceeds that amount also, then that person is deemed to then it is deemed to be an offense under the Negotiable Instruments Act, and the person shall be punished with either an imprisonment which extends to a term of 2 years, or with fine which may extend to twice the amount of the check, or with both. Now let's break down the essential of this particular section. So you need somebody who has drawn a check in favor of his bank, and the check has been returned with insufficient, with an acknowledgement of insufficient funds, and the money, the check that has been drawn, is drawn against a legally payable debt. In case of all the three of these matching, and if you have these three basic ingredients, then you can then you can serve them a notice. Now the next part of the section says that provided nothing in this section shall apply unless the check has been presented within the period of limitation. Now that every check has a period of validity, so it should be presented within the period of validity from the date on which the check has been issued. The payee or the holder in due course. Now, a payee is a person to whom the check is given as in order to discharge the debt or the legal liability for payment. Or a holder in due course, if you can see, a holder in due course is somebody who holds the check in the due course of. So I give the check to somebody, and that X person gives it to somebody else. All the three of us are doing it in order to discharge a particular debt. So the X person gives it to A. So the A person is a holder in due course according to this particular act. A holder in due course is also eligible to file uh, a case, a complaint against me under section 138. If the check is bounced, the first thing that you need to do is within 15 days of the day of the check being dishonored, you will receive a memorandum from the bank. From that day, within 15 days, you have to, within 30 days, you have to serve them a notice. Serve the opposite party, the drawer, a notice. Uh, in that notice, you have to mention the entire transaction, the legal liability of payment, why you are entitled to receive that the amount of the check, and the entire transaction that takes place, and you're supposed to serve it through registered post acknowledgement due. Now after you do it, you make an RPAD. You need to preserve all of those records, the receipt, etc., to make sure that later at the stage, if the after the notice has been served, if the money is not received, then you can go ahead and file the complaint. These are your basic, most important documents of evidence. Next, if after the receipt of the notice by the drawer, he does not make a payment within 15 days, then you can go ahead and file a complaint in the court. It is to be noted that the complaint under this section is a private complaint and is to be lodged directly in the court. The police will not interfere in this matter. Now, presumption, section 139, the next section is the most important section over here. It deals with the presumption, which is that today, if I have a check and the check is dishonored, and somebody has given the check to me and I complain that the check has been dishonored, there is a presumption which is raised that the person who has issued the check has issued it to me by way of a legally enforceable debt, or it is issued in order to discharge a legal liability for payment. Now, this presumption is contrary to the nature of common law, which is that in a person until proven guilty is innocent. However, here a person is in the first instance itself, the fact that a check has been dishonored raises the presumption that the person is guilty. The onus of proving that the same has not been discharged against a legal liability for payment rests on the accused. The accused has to rebut this presumption very, very successfully, and only then that only when the presumption is successfully rebutted, the person can say that the check has not been issued against legal liability, and hence he's not liable to either of the penalties. Now, in the case of Oriental Bank of Commerce, it was held, which was a landmark case of 2019. It was held that Oriental Bank of Commerce versus Prabodh Kumar Tiwari. It was a landmark case of the Supreme Court in the year 2019. That the admission of check, the admission of the signature on check, along with no successful rebuttal to the presumption of Section 139 itself is sufficient to prove that the check was issued against a legal liability for payment, and hence in that matter the accused was held guilty under Section 138. Also, in case a person is not guilty, now if one of my check is dishonored, if I have not issued a check to anybody and it has been dishonored, say I have lost the check, etc., for any reason, somebody holds my check and it has my signature, and they deposit it and the check is dishonored because I don't have a legal liability to payment. Then what happens is, and I'm served with a notice. So if I am not guilty under Section 138, if I'm not liable to pay, the first thing I'll do is I'll reply to the notice saying that I don't hold any liability. So a person to whom a notice has been served, and if the person stays quiet with respect to his liability for payment, then it is presumed that the person is in fact legally liable, and Section 139, the presumption is raised against him. It is also of paramount importance over here, let me mention it to you, that the notice is successfully served. Now, when you say notice is successfully served, when you issue a notice, you you post it through RPAD2, and the same reaches. Now, most of them come with different kinds of acknowledgements, say left or not received or unclaimed. So we have a lot of case laws and a lot of deliberations made by the Supreme Court in which they have made it amply clear that if a person is trying to intentionally dodge the notice, and if you can successfully prove that the acknowledgement which the notice has been returned with, if it has not been served, is indicative of the fact that the accused is only trying to dodge the notice, then the notice is deemed to be served. In any case, Section 27 of General Clauses Act also says that the fact that you've made a payment, you have a receipt, itself is conclusive to assume that a notice of a service is being made. That's in Section 27 of General Clauses Act. Now, coming to section 140, what defense may not be raised in by the prosecution under section 138? It shall not be a defense in the prosecution for an offense under section 138 that the drawer had no reason to believe when he issued the check. So I can't be clueless. If I am drawing a check, I'm issuing it. I cannot be totally clueless that मुझे पता ही नहीं था. I had no clue when this was done and why this was done, and I was clueless. So that cannot be valid defense. The next section is again of importance. Now, offenses by companies. So what happens if a company, if the check of a company is dishonored? In that case, because this is a criminal section, okay, this the main objective of section 138 is that they penalize the dishonor of a check. So what happens is, in a course of business, people misuse these instruments. They simply give a check, a post-dated check, and then it is dishonored, and nothing can be done against them. In order to stop this, they have made this use of negotiable instruments arbitrarily. They've penalized it. Now, if any company does it, then the vicarious liability falls under the person, the CEO or the director or the managing director, whoever is in charge at that point in time of the company, and he shall be held criminally liable to the extent that he or she can be imprisoned. I'll read the section. If the person committing an offense under 138 is a company, every person who at that time of the offense was committed, whoever was in charge and was responsible to the company for the conduct of the business of the company, as well as the company, shall be deemed to be guilty of an offense and shall be liable to proceed against and punished accordingly. Which here also makes it very important for me to mention that in case something of this kind happens, it is important that you not only join the name of the company, but you also join the name of all the directors. If you don't do that, then the cognizance will not be taken against the director, and the complaint itself will not succeed. It will culminate into a criminal inquiry and not into a criminal case. Another 4 or 5 months of deliberations and clarifications will go until a cognizance is taken and summons is issued. So this is a technical factor. So if it's a partnership company, write the name of the company and all the names of all of the partners. If it's a sole proprietary, do it accordingly. If it's a company, registered company under Companies Act, then you have to do it accordingly. You have to join the company, as well as all the other directors and people in charge of the company, basically. And you have to serve the notice to each and every person. You cannot take a leeway in that. Now, what happens if vicarious liability in the case of Jaya Lakshmi Nataraj versus Gina and Company? The accused was the MD. So, what happened in this case? It was fun. MD of the company was predominantly a housewife, and the defense was raised that she was a housewife. Her name was only used for the namesake, and she had nothing to do with the affairs of the company. Now, section 141 says that until and unless the director of the company can prove that that the check was issued beyond his or her knowledge, or that he or she could not have, with a reasonable level of due diligence, found out that something of that a check or a negotiable instrument to that effect has been executed, and the same might be dishonored. Only in that case that the person can take the defense and be prevented from imprisonment under section 138. So over here also, in the case that I mentioned, they said that the woman is not aware of the day-to-day affairs of the company, and a lot of people do that. They only use a woman's name. The woman is their mother or somebody who is just a housewife, but for namesake they make them her a director of the company. And in such cases, if the check is dishonored, then she also has to bear the brunt of the law. And so the reason which was raised was that she is not qualified, she does not understand the day-to-day function. Her name was only there for namesake. Now, in this particular case, the Supreme Court successfully held that yes, she could take advantage of not being informed, and so criminal actions were not taken against her. However, it clearly also stated that you cannot a managing director or whole time director or CEO or whatever, by whatever name you call the person, any authority who's employed in such a way or is in such a position by mere uh, establishment of the company, that with that issuance of a check or a negotiable instruments and the subsequent dishonor would all necessarily be of his or her would necessarily be in his or her knowledge, then the person cannot escape the liability under section 141. Section 142 is of the cognizance of the offences. Now, there is also a latest amendment in which provision has been made with respect to under section 143A, that once the complaint has been filed and you put in an application in front of the judge has the power to grant a deposit amount or to the extent of 20% of the amount of check. So say if my check has value of say 1 lakh rupees and I am the complainant, I can plead and put in an application to the judge to deposit an amount up to 20% for, say you can say that it is a penal charges. So 20,000 rupees I can ask the judge to get deposited in my account from the account of the accused till the pendency of the case, until the case is pendent. After the case has been decided either ways, then the judgment takes, whichever way the judgment takes, accordingly the 20,000 is deducted and the remaining amount is awarded, whatever is decided as per the merits of the case. In case, in such a scenario, the case goes against the complainant has to pay 20,000 rupees and an additional penalty charge towards it. So that's about it, about section 138. I'll take some questions. What if a check is dishonored and the bank memo says that the funds insufficient? However, when check is presented before the bank, it appears that there was no date on it. Does that make the case weak? Obviously, that makes the case weak. In if something of this nature comes to your notice, first of all, the check cannot be presented. Check without a date cannot be presented for honor. In case it is and something and a blunder of this kind is made, then you cannot proceed to file a case complaint. You need to present the check again with a date on it. So there's this question, section 140 defense. In a joint family, the eldest brother has blank checkbooks signed by other three brothers and manages their accounts and payments of family through their checkbooks. A few signed blank checks are missing of one brother. How to prevent misuse? I'll stop my reading over here. First of all, if you notice that a few check leaves are not in your checkbook, the first thing you do is lodge an FIR. If one brother misused a signed blank check of another brother by withdrawing a certain amount without his knowledge or made a payment to someone else, what defense can be used by the victim? Coming on to the second question, in such a scenario, it is important to prove that there was no legal liability of that particular brother to pay the ex person, that he was not legally liable. And if a complaint to the extent has been lodged already, if the check leaves are missing and an FIR has been made that these numbers of check are missing from my checkbook, then the the case is open and shut. It will be immediately indicated that the second brother had taken these checks, had stolen these checks, and then given it to another person. So it's a win-win situation. How to prevent this misuse while partition of property among the brothers? Now this is tricky because in a partition suit, a lot of things are there to prove. So this has to be on case to case basis. You can't really comment on this. So in case a check is missing, and so you make sure that you lodge an FIR first. So in the section, there's somebody who says the section clearly states to the extent of 20%, but in all cases, the judge order charge full 20% of the amount. Is there any judgment against this? No, there is so far no judgment against this. A complainant is entitled, I feel, as a part of the penal process. So if you have to take money from someone, and you have to also wait to take that money, and while you're waiting, if 20% of the check amount has been awarded to you, it can really loosen up the burden on your back, with respect to the litigation costs. So I don't think there's a need for that. If plaintiff is a senior citizen and has appointed a power of attorney, I'm sorry, but this section is a criminal section. I don't think the in only in extreme medical emergencies can exemption be granted, but an exemption can be granted by executing a power of attorney to be present in the court. One cannot take the burden off himself. In case a person is convicted, then the person has to take the conviction. uh, Jurisdiction, the jurisdiction, earlier there was a huge problem, hue and cry. Now it is clear, wherever you present the check for honor, in whichever bank branch the same has been dishonored, the jurisdiction is decided accordingly. Now, this is a very interesting question. Does Money Lenders Act apply even if a loan is given against the security of check? Yes. Yes. So there are provisions, there are innumerable cases which say that a security check is very much admissible in court and under section 138 if it is against um, given to the court, to the bank, or under Money Lenders Act, provided that the duration of the check is the validity period of the check is not exhausted. Now, what if you do not have a check? In that case, you have the provision of Order 37. Now, Order 37 of the Civil Procedure Code also can be used, but in very peculiar circumstances. Was deposited and bounced. A security check notice was sent within 30 days. However, no payment was received, and a complaint was not filed within the time frame, and it has been 4 to 6 months now. What can be the other way forward for me? So, in case a complaint has not been filed within the time duration, within the time stipulated in the law, then you can only use that particular check as an evidence, and not furthermore. You can file a civil case for recovery, and you can use it in evidence. So Order 37, I'm coming to that. Order 37 is a provision under civil law. It is a proper civil suit. Now what happens is it is applicable upon any kinds of contracts which are made. So promissory note, bills of exchange, hundies. It so Order 37 is only effectual if you have a contract to the extent of payment, promise of payment. So you and me, between us, we make a contract that X amount you will give me at X time, and a contract is made for to that effect. Only and only then can you can file a case under Order 37. So Order 37 does not cover invoices or transaction made for sale of goods, etc. In Order 37, usually you can directly go to the court, file for a remedy, and the court issues a summons and for appearance of the defendant within 10 days. And the defendant is not entitled by the receipt of the summons to defend his case. The contract which you present while filing off your a suit itself is a conclusive proof that there has been a monetary transaction and that you are entitled to money. When a defendant is called upon within 10 days to submit his side of the story, he has to first take leave to defend. He has to take permission in order to make a defense. only and only if the permission is granted can he raise his side of argument. When can a permission be granted? Usually the permission is granted in 90% of the cases. Only in 10% of the cases where the defendant is not able to convince in his preliminary submissions that he does not owe any kind of money to the plaintiff, only in those case scenarios the judge the judge refuse the leave to defend. Most judges do not, and it is by matter of practice that the leave to defend is granted and the defendant is given a chance to present his side of the story, and in that he has to make arguments with respect to that he's not entitled to pay, etc. The time frame over here is also important. One cannot simply come at any time. The procedure for filing of a summary suit is just as a normal suit. It goes in the same manner. There are innumerable directions that under Order 37, it's a summary suit and has to be heard and decided within 6 months of institution of the suit. However, a lot goes into play when a suit is filed, whether the notice has been served properly, whether it has reached, whether the defendant has been given sufficient time to be present before the court, and so on and so forth. So usually it is not possible for the same to be decided in within 6 months. Not necessarily it is not decided. A lot of it goes very quick, and if the defendant is present in time, the procedure of the court runs away very quickly. In Order 37, the advantage over here is if the defendant is not present within the stipulated time, then the plaintiff can go in for an ex parte hearing. Now there's a question, ma'am. One person I know, he gave some 12 lakh rupees to another person in cash. Now that person is not giving the money. The other thing is the person who gave money doesn't have money lending license. What we can do? Person is in need of money and very innocent. Now first things first. In case so first of all, 12 lakh rupees diya hai, so it has been given in cash. Now here I would like to include that when you give such an amount in cash, you need to be sure that your income tax returns of the year in which you have given 12 lakh rupees are subsequently strong to show that you have enough cash on hand to give that kind of cash, that you can arrange that kind of cash. So that is first there. You have to be very sure with that. You need to consult the CA with respect to that. Secondly, where if an amount of 12 lakh rupees is given, I'm assuming that some written execution of proof of giving that amount would be there. Some kind of a person in presence of which the money is given. If all those things are there, then you can proceed to file a civil money recovery suit, which I'll move on to the next. In case not, if you have a check bounce, then very good. Then a check, then you can get it bounced and later on go into the nitty-gritties of doing it. Always remember that whenever money is being lended, whether or not you are a money lender or otherwise, money can be lended. First thing, that the amount that you are lending should be such that you are able to show it in your hand. You are able to show it that you are capable of producing that kind of an amount in cash. The court usually does not take suo motu cognizance of any kind of black money or anything like that. That is not the court's job. The court's job is to determine whether you had the money to give 12 lakh rupees in the first place. Secondly, while you are giving that kind of a money, it's best to execute a written document that money has been given for the mere proof. Notarize it, and so that you have something to call yours as an evidence. Today I get up and say that tomorrow I have given my friend 10 lakh rupees. I show it on cash on hand also. But my friend is going to deny it, because what is the proof that he has accepted or he has received that 10 lakh rupees? So all those are a matter of evidence. And as long as those evidence are in place, then this kind of a case can take a longer time to pursue, but not necessarily that the results are going to be negative. Moving on, there are also normal money recovery suit under section 4 of the CRPC, which are filed. in that, that's a normal suit, that's a regular suit or a special suit. So suits which are of a monetary value of say 10 lakh rupees or more, come 10 lakh rupees or more are under the purview of special civil suit, and below that value are regular civil suits. You have to pay the stamp duty, write your side of story, attach your evidences, and the suit proceeds as like any other civil suit. Uh, Summons is issued to the defendant. The defendant is present. Defendant puts his written statement. Issues are framed, and then evidences are recorded on the basis of the issues which are framed. The process is slower than obviously the check bouncing or order 37, but that's about it. One more provision of law is under the Commercial Courts Act. This is also fairly very recent development, and it is also very interesting. Now, these apply to another class of persons. So, Commercial Courts Act, this was a fairly recent establishment. It is done in order to settle majorly disputes of businessmen, entrepreneurs, so that the entrepreneurs do not have to spend too much time in pursuing pursuing a matter at the court, considering the courts are burdened with a lot of these kinds of family matter. So commercial dispute means the matters which can be filed under this act are the following, are only those which can qualify as a commercial dispute, and they include the following: ordinary transaction of merchants, bankers, financiers, traders, etc. Export and import of merchandise or services. Issues relating to admiralty and maritime law. Transactions relating to aircraft, aircraft engines, aircraft equipment, helicopters, etc. Carriage of goods, construction and infrastructure contracts, including tenders. Agreements relating to movable property used exclusively in trade or commerce. Franchisee agreements, distribution of licensing agreements, management and consultancy agreements, joint venture agreements, shareholder agreements. Pretty much everything has been included in this. Mercantile agency, mercantile usage, partnership agreements, technology development agreements. So any kind of agreement or a contract to the effect that monetary transaction is being involved comes under this Commercial Disputes Act. Now, Commercial Disputes Act has a very good feature. In order to go under the Commercial Disputes Act, you first thing that you need to do is to apply in the respective arbitration and mediation department of every court. Every court has an arbitration and mediation cell, the subordinate courts. Now you go and you apply over there. They have a form to fill, and after you fill the form, you apply over there and say that a transaction of the nature has been has happened and you are entitled to receive money. They will send a notice for arbitration slash mediation to the opponent, and the opponent, if the opponent replies, instead of going into the court procedure, they will make sure the court will itself, this wing, arbitration wing of the court itself, will make sure that the matter is resolved through mediation and conciliation, and litigation is not resorted to, which cuts down a lot of your time and energy and litigation costs. In case the opponent does not reply or is not present for the arbitration, then they issue a certificate to the effect that they have made reasonable reasonable deliberations, and try to resort to a mediation between the two parties. However, the opposite party has not responded as expected, and so they give that certificate, and you can file a case under Commercial Disputes Act. Now, earlier provisions were made that a separate court be established for the same. However, the same has not been done. Now, if your claim is until 1 crore rupees, then the same is filed in the respective court of your, in the subordinate court, district court of your jurisdiction. And if it exceeds 1 crore rupees, then commercial courts are established, separately established, and your claim can go in those courts. This is another very quick method and time saving and also energy savings. And as you can see, pretty much all transactions are covered under this: insurance, reinsurance, construct of agency. Very important over here, which could pertain to the present day scenario, is that it includes all the transaction of the merchants and traders also. So entrepreneurs are protected under this act, and it is a very good way to secure your receivables. In case of dishonor of a promissory note, what is the procedure and can the aggrieved seek compensation? Yes, if there is a promissory note, then Order 37 can be invoked, and under this Civil Procedure Code, I'm afraid no criminal actions can be taken. But if you have a promissory note, and in order to honor the promissory note, you can extract a check from the person, then you can go ahead and proceed with the check bouncing laws. Compensation, you can ask for interest on your principal amount. So there was a question: what is the limitation to file summary suit? Money recovery and summary suits shall be filed within 3 years of from the time the transaction has happened. Can we file both criminal case and summary suit? I'm afraid not. You cannot take two cores of laws together. You have to file a criminal case, but between the two, it is advisable that you file a criminal case. Orders passed under mediation, commercial courts, will it be enforceable and executable? Yes, they will be. They are legitimate orders. They are, however, the binding effect depends. Not necessarily both the parties are going to be agreeable to the decision that is passed. So subsequently, if they do not agree on the process of mediation, then the court is always there. Follow up from the previous question of failing to file complaint under 138 within the time limit. Another way forward can be a commercial suit. The parties were sole proprietors and it was an agreement to buy and sell goods. Traders, basically. Yes, you can do that. You can use the. So the question is, if a person has exhausted the time frame within which section 138, so complaint under section 138 can be filed, can the person go ahead and file a case under commercial suit if it qualifies as a commercial dispute? Yes, and you can use the check as a matter of evidence. Of course, you can. Can the section of criminal breach of trust be invoked for recovering money? It depends. The section of criminal breach of trust is usually used along with section 420 cheating. So section 419 of the Indian Penal Code. However, I have a little concern with respect to this, that when you go to the police station to file a case of section 419, 420, subsequently for criminal breach of trust in the police station, the police is not agreed to, to step into a monetary transaction at first instance. So you have to very clearly to them only, because as a matter of preliminary inquiry, they have that power. Before lodging an FIR, they have the power to make a preliminary inquiry, and if they feel that this is a purely monetary transaction, they will close your complaint by saying that they have been given specific instructions by the Supreme Court at a lot of junctures that any transaction involving money, they are not supposed to go ahead and lodge FIRs. But if you can prove to them that the ingredients of criminal breach of trust along with fraud and etc are totally met with, and it's a legitimate case, and if they are convinced and they go ahead and file an FIR, then you surely can invoke those sections. However, I'm very skeptical whether they are going to lodge an FIR to that extent. Usually they are not very keen on doing that. Insurance contracts are dealt in consumer courts. Now here, here I can please clarify what insurance contract can come under arbitration and mediation. See, insurance claim contracts, Now there are options under Consumer Act also and under the Commercial Courts Act also. People prefer the consumer courts because it's a tribunal. It is very consumer driven. Most judgments are in favor of the consumer and not in favor of the insurance company. And because it's a consumer driven court and predominantly, it operates with a mindset that a consumer is aggrieved and he shall be given the necessary remedy, there are more chances of recovery under consumer court than in a commercial court, hence consumer court. Yes, we can go under what section 156(3). If the police is adamant and does not lodge an FIR, I cannot. My fellow companion says that they have succeeded in 90% of the cases. I'm really glad that they have, but I cannot vouch upon the percentage that has been given over here. In most cases, it does not succeed. But as I said, if you can prove the elements of law of criminal breach of trust and the sections that you're alleging, then obviously then the court will also rule in your favor. Next, and the last one that I would like to take is money recovery under insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now that is an exhaustive topic, so I would like to only briefly outline the same. It applies the people who can gain advantage under the insolvency and bankruptcy code are companies which are incorporated, LLP under the Companies Act, LLPs, then then firms incorporated under the Partnership Act, and personal guarantors or corporate debtors, partnership firms and proprietorship firms, individuals and other persons. So here you can approach to the adjudicating authority. The adjudicating authority is the company law tribunal, the company law tribunal, and you can, in case you have a debt, the debts are also of different kinds. Corporate, you can be either a corporate debtor or a financial debtor or an operational debtor. I will not, since it's a topic in its own self, I will not. So what happens is, before I go on to the definitions explaining, what happens is, in case there's a default and the class of persons which I earlier mentioned, they can invoke their receivables by serving a notice. In the notice, you have to attach all the necessary documents claiming whatever the transactions have been made and how you have arrived to be able to receive that particular amount. Now after you send the notice and serve the notice, and if there is no dispute which has been raised by the opponent, you can file, you can go ahead and to the educating and file an application in the adjudicating authority, and within 14 days, if the adjudicating authority is satisfied that there is a legitimate claim, there is no subsequent dispute with respect to the claim, and then they can proceed, and the application is admitted. Once the application is admitted over here, what happens is public notices are given out inviting other claimants also, and it's sort of a liquidation which goes into place. The entire institution are go into liquidation. The bankruptcies subsequently declared that the people are not capable of paying, and then their assets are attached and the same are liquidated, and the creditors are paid. The creditors are invited through public notice. Everybody has to file their respective claims, and then a person is appointed, and the person which the court appoints distributes the assets, the money received from liquidation of the assets equitably amongst all the creditors. Usually companies and business institutions do not take the risk. So if you go under this insolvency and bankruptcy code, what happens is that against the person against whom you are ready to file an application readily comes down for for a settlement, and through the process of the court only, they apply for a moratorium period within which they fix monthly installments, they issue PDCs, and the money is recovered very quickly, because nobody wants to take the risk of winding up their own business and going into liquidation if they are actually capable of paying. They just buy some time, and through from the court itself, the entire process is, it's not like an out of court settlement, it is monitored by the court, and money is recovered successfully through this process. So what if the bank knowingly deposits, there's a question, what if the bank knowingly deposits the check given as a part of loan security under personal vendetta? What in when a case under section 138 is filed, the employees of the bank are also examined, and they are also asked questions, examined and cross-examined both. Their personal vendetta or whatever you are claiming over here, which is not clear, I'm sorry, can be brought into notice of the court, and protection can be taken. If a company has 3 directors and the check issued by the company gets dishonored, however, after filing of the case, 2 directors appear in court and the third director is out of the country and summons cannot be served on him. Will the case proceed? How to proceed in such situation? Yes, the case will very much proceed. If the person is out of India, the case cannot stay pending for the time that the person can return, and the remedy cannot await until then. The case will proceed against the remaining 2 directors, and and a non-bailable. So what happens is, in a check bouncing case, you issue a summons. The person has received the summons yet is not present before the court. Then a warrant is issued, bailable warrant, and the person is still not present. And then a non-bailable warrant is issued, and the person is still not present. So then when a warrant is issued and person is not present, and a non-bailable warrant is then subsequently issued against a person, then whenever the person comes down to your country, you can make sure that the person is arrested. So in one of my cases, something like that happened. A woman executed a check, and she went away to New Zealand. The check was issued is drawn in favor of my client. She had taken around 5 lakh rupees from my client as hand loan. My client issued the check for honor, and the same was dishonored. Now that woman is on a student visa in the New Zealand, and there are no signs of her returning right now. And owing to the present day situation, obviously the travel is not going to be possible. So now the case is successfully on NBW. We have issued a non-bailable warrant, and still because she's not there, we can't do anything. In this case, section 82 of the CRPC can be resorted to. Here, she is a private individual. This is a company, so you can't use it against a company. But against a private individual who is absconding, in that you can apply to the court to declare this person absconding from the process of law, and subsequently an absconding person's whatever property that person holds in his name in your country, in India, the same can be attached under the next section of section 83 of CRPC. So that you can do. That is a remedy which you have against persons who are absconding the process of law. We've declared a person absconding, given a public notice to that extent also, and against the person. And after the public notice was given, we proceeded to attach the property which the person held over here. If a person owes some money by way of personal agreement, no contract, however, witness is present, then the cash was handed over, defaults in repayment. Is there any legal recourse for the debtor to enforce payments from such creditor? Legal recourse is there. You can see it is a battle very difficult to win. You can fight. You don't have to leave your money without fighting, but because there is no documentary evidence, it's going to be difficult to prove. However, if witnesses are there and they're ready to testify, then the situation can be different. You can file a civil case in this matter. Is the limitation period of notice 15 or 30 days? I'm assuming this is under section 138. The limitation to serve a notice is for 30 days. So from the day of the day on which the notice has been dishonored, the check has been dishonored, and you obtain a memorandum to that effect from the bank, from that day you count 30 days. Within those 30 days, you have to serve the notice. Now, after the service has been done, from that day you count the for 15 days for the subsequent reply of the person to whom the notice has been served. If the 15 days lapse, then on the 16th day, starting from the 16th day, you can file a case. Which court shall have jurisdiction placed on the branch of bank where check was issued or check was bounced or issue was placed? The place where the check was dishonored. That is the place where the court has jurisdiction.